Long before we had the SUV or even the station wagon, America had the depot hack. What's a depot hack? Well, I'm glad you asked. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, and I'm here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix, a great collection, more than 170 cars that tell all kinds of interesting stories about the history of the automobile. And this 1915 Ford Model T depot hack is an important part of that journey because it really is the beginning of the station wagon. But first, make sure you like and subscribe, and in the comments down below, let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong, and whether you have any fun Model T stories. All right, back to our 1915 Model T depot hack, and I guess the first thing I have to do is explain what a hack is and how it evolved into something much more familiar. You see, back in the 1600s, a hackney was an ordinary riding horse. When hooked up to a wagon, well, then it became a hackney coach, and it evolved into what was basically the early taxi, which was eventually shortened to just hack. And a depot hack, well, that was the taxi that picked up people at the train depot, and eventually people started calling the train depot a train station. And a hack, well, that became wagon. And thus was born the term that we came to know and love, station wagon, which evolved from the depot hack. Now, while this is a Ford Model T depot hack, the reality is Ford didn't build them. Back then you had coach builders, companies like Martin Perry, York, or plenty of others that would buy a bare chassis from Ford. Some would become delivery trucks. Others, well, they became hacks for hauling people. They were nearly always built with wooden bodies because it was simply the easiest way for a small company to build a body for that bare chassis. Some were actually sold as kits. People could put them together on their own or as complete bodies and put on by the company. Now, everyone I have ever seen has open sides, which is great for airflow, but when the weather turned bad, they usually had some kind of removable curtains for the side. They weren't glamorous and they weren't luxurious. They were simply transportation. Let's take a walk around and look at our 1915 Model T depot hack so we can get the full appreciation for what they've done here. And of course, everything from that cowl forward is pretty much just your standard Model T. You see the crank down there. We'll talk more about how they would crank to start this. That standard front suspension with the elliptical leaf springs that went from side to side, which is different than a lot of cars, but it was also less expensive to build. They sold about 308,000 Model Ts in the year 1915, so they were really cranking along. And they had a whole variety of ones that you could buy. They had the runabout, they had the touring, the sedan, the town car, the coupe. I've heard it pronounced both couplet and couple, but since it's a cross between a coupe and a cabriolet, I'll go with the couple. And of course, you could get the bare chassis. Now, that bare chassis was going to cost around $410. If you wanted just a simple runabout, that was going to cost you about $440. Everything, once again, is pretty standard, except for the fact that it's got this wooden body on it. Standard artillery-style wheels. These are 30-inch wheels. As I recall, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I thought the wheels in the front were just slightly narrower than the wheels that would come on the back. Here you see this great wooden body, and once again, plenty of companies were building these kits. And just like any Model T, you have a door on the passenger side, but you have no door on the driver's side over there. Now, there's a variety of different reasons that have been stated for that. Some say, well, it was safer that way. You weren't getting out into traffic. A lot of people say it was simply a way to save money, so you didn't have to have hinges or whatever else was on the other side. Even a Model T just did not have a driver's side door for an awful long time. Of course, this one has both the passenger side door here as well as the passenger side over there as well. In the back, now you had plenty of places to have people, right? You could easily sit, 6, 7, 8 people in here. Where would you take their luggage? Well, back here, you had this. You had a way to flip this tailgate down, and I have no doubt these tailgates were then piled up with luggage that would then get stacked up. So the tailgate was really the place where you would put your trunk, because remember, a trunk was simply a box that was put onto the back of the car. But the great woodwork, I absolutely love the way it's been put together. And I should point out, right next to this depot hack here at the Martin Auto Museum, We have another depot hack. This one is from 1928, so much, much newer. A little more modern seats that have been put in and a much more modern dashboard inside. But ultimately the same concept that they were doing for an awful long time because, Ford, as I mentioned, did not get into the depot hack business in the very beginning. Big, huge running boards. This car does, however, have a passenger side door on here. Funny that we gave the passenger a door to get in, but we didn't give the driver a door to get in. People think that the Model T didn't change over all those years. It started in 1908, went all the way to 1927. But the reality is they did change it. In fact, there's a huge change that would come with the radiator grille. In just a couple of years, it would get a little more curve to it, a little different angle, look completely different, not this big brass thing. Another thing that was really important in 1915 that happened was the fact that they went to electric headlights that were run off of the magneto. Up until that point, they'd just been using those gas acetylene flame lamps, which are similar to what we have up here. See these things? These are actually designed to be, have a little oil tank down here. You'd light them and use them that way. But for 1915, they moved to the electric light, which I'm sure were pretty dim. Now, as you can see, these have been modified since then. They have a much better electrical connection in the back. They're probably running off a better electrical system, so we can see just a little more light. But overall, you get the impression of what it was like to be in a depot hack back in 1915. Maybe you just arrived at the train station, and this was what was coming to pick you up. All right, we're going to get into our 1915 Model T depot hack in just a moment. But first, of course, I'm not going to get in on that side. I'm going to get in over here because, as I mentioned, for the drivers for Model Ts, the door was only on the passenger side. Once again, was it safety, save money? Hard to say. But before I get on, I do want to point one thing out. If you're going to fill the car up with fuel, this is where you're going to do it because the fuel tank is underneath the driver's seat. There, you see it right there. You'd simply fill it up with whatever fuel you had, kerosene, benzene, ethanol, put that back on, and then you'd climb aboard. There's enough room, but to be honest with you, there's not a massive amount of room up here, whether it's for one person or for two. But once again, it was a car. It was the ability to, well, not sit on top of a horse. And think about that. That was the norm back in those days. The controls for driving a Model T are completely different than anything you're used to today. A modern driver simply cannot get into one of these cars and figure out how to start it. I mean, not the least of which is no electric starter, right? There's a crank on the front of this. And cranking it over is not necessarily an easy thing to do. It has to happen in just the right sequence. And you don't have a gas pedal. You have a throttle lever, which is right here on the right side of the steering wheel. On the left side of the steering wheel, we have something called the advance for advancing the spark. And what you didn't want to do, you didn't want to have the advance set in the position where it was advanced because it could potentially backfire when you were cranking that engine over. And if it backfired, well, the crank could come back. People were notorious for breaking their arms or getting hit in the face. That's why the gentleman who invented the electric starter, Kettering, did that because he had a friend who was hurt pretty severely, as I recall, by the crank backfiring. The pedals on the bottom, well, once again, they're not the way you're used to seeing them. Pedals may look the same, but they're very different. Over here, you've got the transmission. That's where you change it from high to low gear. In the center, well, that was your reverse. And over here, well, this was your brake. No throttle down below. And this over here on the left side, well, that's a handbrake that also kind of engages the clutch at the same time. Down here, this would be the ignition switch. I believe you would move it to the right to start it. You'd move it to the left to have the magneto running so that you had the ability to, keep it running and charging the engine. 1915, as I recall, I think that was the year they also came up with the electric horn. Now, everybody always thinks that the old cars, especially Model Ts, would have those klaxon, the Awuga horns. As I recall, I don't think Model Ts ever came with those. I could be wrong, and please correct me in the comments below if I am, but I think they never came with the klaxon horn. But they did start moving to an electric horn right about this time. So it's rudimentary, it's basic, you would have to get out, start it, get back in. In a perfect world, you could start it with somebody else here so they could manage the throttle and the spark. But a lot of people were able to do it on their own. And of course, once you got it running, well, then you could cruise off to the train depot, using it like a taxi and pick up your passengers. When you lift the hood on a 1915 Ford Model T depot hack, what you're looking at is one of the most important automobile engines ever made. By 1950, the Model T had been in production for about 7 years. And while this engine looks pretty similar to the original 1908 design, it had already been evolving at this point. It was smoother, it was more reliable, it was really more refined. Now, it was still 177 cubic inches, it produced about 20 horsepower, but what really made this engine so remarkable wasn't the power. It was the way it delivered that performance at an incredibly low cost. It was very, very easy to repair, and unlike an awful lot of the cars of the time, which had complicated multi-cylinder engines or exotic ignition systems, the Model T's power plants were built for the average driver, farmer, shopkeeper, somebody who was handy, but not necessarily a mechanic. From 1908 to 1915, Ford made improvements like strengthening the crankshaft, improving the cooling systems, and small changes to the ignition coils and the carburetor. What truly set the Model T apart back then really was its integrated design. The engine and the transmission shared a single housing, something revolutionary at the time. And inside that housing was the famous planetary transmission. It had just 2 forward speeds and a reverse. That's it. Another difference was the magneto ignition system. It was built right into the engine's flywheel. Instead of relying on a separate battery, which was, well, very unreliable back then, and it was hard to maintain in rural America, the Model T would generate its own ignition power. And of course, because gas stations were, still a very rare sight, the Model T engine was capable of running on a variety of fuels. It could run on benzene, it could run on ethanol, it could run on kerosene. But one thing that they did not have in this engine back in 1915 was a water pump. The first Model Ts actually did have them, but Ford quickly changed to something called thermosiphon. That's where the hot water rises to the top of the engine and into the radiator, and then the cooler water goes down. Now, to be honest, it's not great for modern engines, but it was just fine for the Model T back then. Companies like Packard, Cadillac, Pierce Arrow, well, they were experimenting with, 4, 6, 8-cylinder complicated engines with complicated ignition systems. But Ford, well, they went the other direction completely, keeping the engine as simple as possible, removing all of the unnecessary parts, making it both easy to build and easy to maintain. And by 1915, more than 500,000 of these engines were already on the road. Now, as you can see, ours has been modified over time. Yes, that is a distributor in there. Not sure where it's from, perhaps a Volkswagen. But a lot of people over time have taken to modifying these Model T engines to keep them on the road. As America's needs evolved, depot hacks, well, they changed with them. By the early 1920s, the concept had shifted from shuttle service to general family utility. Now, there's a debate as to who built the first factory station wagon. Some say it was Dodge in 1918, although they really outsourced the body. Others give credit to a car maker called Star that built a wagon back in 1923. Ford, well, they were content to let others do that work for them, at least during the Model T era. In 1929, they built their first factory station wagon on a Model A chassis, and with that, the family wagon was born. A 1915 Model T depot hack is not an antique with just a quirky shape. It is the ancestor of an entire category of American vehicles. The story of how utility, craftsmanship, and a bit of entrepreneurial spirit helped turn the humble Model T into something even more versatile than what Henry Ford ever imagined.